So there were 3 boys in a row, then 4 girls in a row, and then a boy who was 5 years separated. We won't call him a mistake, but there are theories about that.
Welcome to How Did We Get Here, the podcast where each week our 2 talking heads, being myself, Jess Bost,
and Mark Newfield,
bring on guests to learn more about their past 5 jobs before landing where they are today.
Because, as you know, life is super simple, straightforward, and never makes people ask, wait, you did what?
Join us for an honest convo on career exploration, overcoming setbacks, considering when to pivot, and offering encouragement on how to find value in your career and life choices.
And with that, let's ask the question.
Holy crap, how did I get here? Together.
And we are back. Raise your hand. I know everybody's going to want to do this. It's the most fascinating topic ever. But we're going to take, I promise you, a deep dive into macroeconomics, and you're going to like it.
Mark, this is How Did We Get Here? Remind you and everybody, this is a podcast about career exploration, overcoming setbacks, considering when to pivot, offering encouragement. So you tell me where macroeconomics fits into all of that.
Are you trying to imply that economists aren't interesting people who've explored different careers and had setbacks? Are you actually trying to imply that?
I would never.
Well, the easy answer is our guest today, who really and truly is a macroecon whiz. You ought to follow him on Twitter because you could learn a lot. You know, we brought him onto the show to share his career exploration journey, and he was excited to do it. And we both know him, so and we knew we'd have a good conversation. From an interesting family background, if I remember correctly, his dad is a DC policeman, not maybe where you might expect a macroecon genius to come from, and how he overcame the setbacks in his career, you know, where he made pivots. And I think there's a lot of encouragement to listeners. And you don't have to go into macroecon to do it on how to do the same thing. So that's our deep dive into macroecon.
Touche. I agree on all points. So without further ado, we should get to introducing Cullen, don't you think? Then we'll see where the conversation takes us. If it's macroeconomics, so be it.
Well, if it is macroeconomics, I will find a way to make it amusing and interesting, I hope.
Thank you.
I hope. I did some macroecon in my lifetime. At one point in time, I was interested in that field. But in any case, I think we'll all get a little bit smarter today.
Yeah.
Maybe not in a way that we would expect.
Yeah.
But let's start where he started with his family origin story, which is actually pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my story really starts with my family. I mean, I was the 3rd brother. So there were 3 boys in a row, then 4 girls in a row, and then a boy who was 5 years separated. We won't call him a mistake, but there are theories about that. And he's actually the best of the lot. So if he was a mistake, he's the best mistake that happened to the family. No, 8 of us, and my parents always worked. My parents were crazy in that they insisted on spending basically every dime they ever made on our educations, which is, you know, in retrospect, I'm like eternally in debt to my parents because they basically pushed back their retirements. My dad still works, which is part, you know, by choice, but also part because of having 8 children that were very expensive. And he was, by background, he was a Marine and a DC cop who turned into an attorney later. He's one of the only attorneys to, maybe the only man ever in the world to have defeated Chuck Norris in something. He defeated Chuck Norris in a lawsuit about 15 years ago.
Shut up. That's such a great...
I thought Chuck Norris wrote the Constitution.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that happen?
Chuck Norris is defeated in everything except this one event against my father.
Accolade.
My son during high school didn't come home with anything but Chuck Norris jokes. I've got to tell him this.
Amazing. Yeah.
I stand corrected. Bruce Lee, I guess, did defeat him in the famous fight in Way of the Dragon. But
scripted, but yes.
Yeah. So anyways, I mean, my father and my parents were really strict by sort of necessity because there were so many of us, and we grew up Roman Catholic. So we all went to religious schools growing up. I went to Jesuit schools basically my entire life, high school Jesuit school in DC, ultimately Georgetown, which is also a Jesuit school. So grew up with
No
this
kidding. Yeah.
really strict sort of Catholic upbringing. But also my mother was very progressive and independent thinking. I mean, still is stubbornly so. And you can imagine having 8 kids will make you, sort of stubborn in certain ways.
And a Marine cop husband. That could have been
Marine cop
interesting.
husband. So it was a nice sort of contrast though, because my mom was, of course, very motherly, but also really pushed us to sort of think outside the box.
Okay, holy crap. So much there already. 8 kids to start with. 8, not a family of 8, a family of 10. 8 kids. That would normally send me running, but honestly, his family dynamics seem enviable. And a mom who's not only motherly, but also pushed her kids to think outside the box, secretly, like... I want to be her. That's who I'm striving to be every day. And like you said, Mark, a Marine cop dad who literally defeated Chuck Norris in something. So yeah, outside looking in, fly on the wall, like it seems like such a good dynamic. And I think I actually would have enjoyed, albeit large, I think I would have enjoyed that family.
I think so too. And it's funny, we grew up fairly close to each other distance wise. That would have been a really cool family to be part of. A little too old for his family, but okay. And the reality is we haven't really heard the half of it.
Yeah, sure.
Bob Seawright being a singing waiter ought to be the top of our, current show team, but I think that's probably not going to be the case. I think Cullen might have an advantage here. When you listen to his discussion of birthing a goat at his farm school, and let's understand he grew up in Washington, D.C., and went to a farm school, but birthing a goat at the age of 8. Now, I don't think he physically birthed the goat, but you have to listen to the story.
Yeah, well, it was weird because I ultimately found myself in lots of different ways, I guess, in part because of all these other great relationships that I've developed. And it's a big part of it was that I got into, my elementary school was a farm school. So I grew up at this, my first really like 10 years of education were really outside the box. I mean, people from Twitter might know that I own chickens, and that education was so, I think, sort of, I don't want to say progressive necessarily, but it was so outside the box for its time that in retrospect, I think that a lot of like the way that I think about the world comes directly from that sort of education where I was almost forced to think so far outside the box of what a normal education was like, because we were learning and doing really unusual things. Like I birthed a goat when I was 8 years old. Not me personally, but
So I thought that Bob Seawright and his singing waiter thing was the top. Right now we're at the top. Birthing a goat is the top.
Yeah, so I extracted a baby goat from, when I was 8 years old. I'm never, like, things like that, though, I'll never forget that, and I step into my chicken coop here at home, and I love the smell of it because I think it brings me back to like those good memories of just being on a farm. And I mean, I remember one day we got to school, there was a literal stampede. The cows had all gotten out and they were running around, and we had to be quarantined. We were quarantined in a classroom for like 4 hours because there were cows just running around outside. So stuff like that was really, it was unusual.
It's formative. Yeah.
And growing up in this big family, I think I just, I developed this sort of weird need for like independence from them because everyone kind of had to fight for their own a little bit, but at the same time learning to appreciate working as a team and being with other people. And one of the coolest things about the way my parents parented is that they not only stayed together for all of this craziness, but I think really instilled in us that we we needed to be really good friends all along the way. And so, all of us are still best friends.
Just hearing it back again, and legit, like I want to know that family. I need his mom to write a book or something. I want to learn a few of her secrets for not just holding it together, but making it through with good kids. Like, I think that's what we all, like, from a parenting standpoint, that's what we're all trying to do. Like, are my kids going to make it? Are they going to grow up and be decent human beings? So good job, Mom. Like, just what a family.
We might need to step outside of FinTwit and have Mom on the show.
I know.
I bet she's got a story. Marine husband, 8 children. I believe they put all of them through college.
Yeah.
At least from talking to Cullen and hearing about, mostly we talked a lot about one of his brothers, right? Advanced educations. The work ethic and learning ethic they established in that family is pretty spectacular, I think.
It's remarkable. Yeah.
But Mom, boy, she probably has a patience award somewhere, or ought to.
Yeah.
Because, as we're about to hear from Cullen, the path looks smooth, right, when you look at it now. But the reality is very few people's paths are smooth, and it certainly probably didn't feel like it. I mean, he's been going up and to the right his whole career. I don't know that it looked that way, and my guess is who knows how Mom and Dad felt when, he probably didn't even make it home from college, right? Just moved directly to California, for example. That probably didn't feel so smooth to everybody. And I think, as you will see with every case, luck is definitely in play here.
Yeah, no, I've been lucky. I was really lucky in that I never had any like really serious family trauma. And that's, a big part of my whole story, I think, is a lot of luck, trying to do the best that I could with the luck that I, was gifted. But also, I've always realized over time that I was very lucky in a lot of different ways. Maybe the luckiest thing that happened to me was I go to Georgetown, and again, freshman year, I was still very lost, trying to find myself. My first half of freshman year was a total disaster, both academically and socially. And in my sophomore year, I kind of start to find my footing. My junior year, a girl from UCLA transfers, and I meet her because, my freshman year in the evenings, I worked as a waiter at a local restaurant, which, by the way, maybe I think the most important job I ever had, because it taught me so much about the service industry and dealing with other people and learning to not only interact and sort of put on a show to some degree, but also just learning to serve other people. And that was the motto at Gonzaga, my high school, is men for others. And so there was always a big need for service and service to others. And, my first real job in college was waiting tables and, learning to serve people and working, crappy hours, making, kind of crappy money, but doing something that, sort of further instilled really a sense of not just service, but also, I think, like hard work and, discipline in a certain aspect of my actual employment. But during this time, I meet my wife, and my wife was somebody who, ultimately my wife, she, at that time, I think was so far out of my league that I almost, for years, and I'm probably still doing this to a large degree, pretending to be someone I'm not, aspiring to her level. And
she might actually love the guy who birthed the goat. It might not be so bad,
Well, I think I was unique in that sense. I was intriguing. I think she may regret it at this point, but I feel like she always pushed me to try to be a little bit of a better person. Because I think she, in some sense, saw the Cullen from high school who was sort of a lost, arrogant, just testosterone-driven idiot. And I think she saw that, hey, there's this guy in there that could be this. Like, why don't you try to be this? And so she always kind of pushed me to be better. And she was better in so many different ways. Like we would study, we both were finance majors. I was a a finance and economics major. I ultimately dropped the economics before I graduated. But in finance, we would study the same classes, and this girl would, we'd go to the same party on Friday night and Sunday night or Saturday night. And then Sunday night, she would cram for an exam, and I'd spend all day studying for the exam. She'd spend an hour studying for it. She'd get an A+ and I'd get a B- or C+. It was that sort of thing where I was like, this person is just different. And I was always sort of aspiring to like that level. And it's funny, a lot of people who probably read my work probably think like, oh, this guy knows a lot about finance. And it's funny, I always say like the real finance expert in the family is my wife. She's a financial damages expert working for, a huge firm on some of the biggest cases in the whole world, and just, a total wizard in finance. But that relationship was really, important because it pushed me to just constantly strive to try to be, I think, a little bit better. And that's kind of how I've been for 25 years, is every day I wake up and I kind of, try to just be like a little bit better, a little bit nicer, a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit smarter.
Okay, so I realize I'm kind of crushing on the women, but it's just, it stands out in his story. He's got a great mom. He's found an amazing wife and partner, now a co-parent, like a mom with him, to raise their girls together. And he talks about just how all along the way, she's pushed him to be this better version of himself. And meanwhile is brilliant in her own right. And so, tipping the hat to luck again, I'd say he's definitely stumbled across a little bit of that in his life. And I want to acknowledge the part of the story, as you've heard some already, and you'll continue to hear, where he puts in a crap ton of work.
And still is
still
today,
does.
I would say. He's not sitting on his hands.
No, that's just part of his fabric, part of who he is. And
yeah.
I had an old soccer coach in high school that would say, fortune favors the prepared. What he was trying to get at in there was to say, when the ball is available, when you're a striker and the ball's available to be hit, kicked into the goal, you have to be there in order to make that play. So the best way to get lucky with that kind of ball is to be in the right place at the right time. And 2 out of those 3 variables, maybe not the ball, but you being in the right place at the right time, is within a measure of your control. So I think we see a lot of that in Cullen's story, where he just keeps showing up. He just keeps thinking about, where can I be and how prepared can I be when I show up there? And that is like wisdom favored luck, or, luck favored wisdom, however you want to piece that together in his story.
My GPA was so bad my freshman year because I spent so much time just being a knucklehead that I ended up graduating in 3.5 years, but I basically spent the full remainder after freshman year swimming against the tide, trying to rectify this huge hole I had dug for myself. So I ultimately graduated with an okay GPA, but nothing that is gonna blow people's minds or anything. Meanwhile, my wife, of course, graduates summa cum laude without even putting in an effort. I was like, screw this girl. I'm jealous. So I graduate, and we kind of went through this whole there's a movie called Family Man with
Nicolas Cage.
Nicolas Cage.
Yeah.
And I had this moment where we both were interviewing for jobs all over the country, and she got jobs from, at the time it was every top investment bank in New York. And I was getting jobs at small life insurance companies. And that's how it was. And we had this moment where it was do we go do the New York thing, or do you go do the New York thing? And we say goodbye to each other. And it was like, in retrospect, like watching that movie always sort of resonates with me because it's like,
Leone,
we chose to do the other thing.
Téa Leoni is the woman. She's brilliant in that movie too. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. It's an awesome movie. And we decided not to do the big city, big finance thing. And instead we moved to California. So did like the exact opposite thing. I ultimately got a job at John Hancock. I was working in basically like a boiler room with 50 other recent college graduates, literally turning the white pages, dialing. It was really hardcore sales. And I was
brutal.
I was terrible at it, like so bad. And part of it was that I was, I guess, relatively analytical at that point. So I was kind of like, I was the guy who, when my boss would say, hey, here's a whole life insurance package that we're going to sell to somebody, get on the phone and here's the talking points for this. And I would actually study the product and run the numbers on it and spend my evenings like actually trying to quantify like, hey, how does this thing work? And then is this a good thing to be actually selling? And I'll never forget like going to my boss and being like, this thing doesn't work the way that we claim it does. Like it doesn't have the benefits that we claim it does in the long run relative to like lots of different other options. I was like,
come on, Cullen. The illustration shows that it's going to be like this.
So it was crazy because like not only was I bad at selling stuff, I think to begin with, but morally I was like, I don't feel comfortable doing this. So if it was something if I really believed in it, I feel like then I could have picked up the phone and said, hey, you should be buying this thing. But the fact that it was something that I really wholeheartedly could not feel good about, like I legitimately did not think was right for people, it just really rubbed me the wrong way. So I only lasted like 6 months at John Hancock.
But as we continue to see things unfold, what I think admire most about Cullen and really everybody that we've talked to is the integrity that they have, the trueness to themselves, that it mattered to him to do the right thing for his clients. I think both of us have built businesses where that's our focus and the rest of it just happens, right?
That's what we want. That's what we hope for. But we put in the integrity piece. Yeah.
Right. And so if you want to look back and be proud of what you've done in the course of your personal life and business career, I'd say pay some attention. Yeah. There are some spark notes here on how to do that.
I moved to Merrill Lynch. I knew a guy who had recently left John Hancock, who was much older than me, and he kind of recruited me to Merrill. And I always wanted to be, my fascination with finance was always like a Buffett disciple to some degree. I enjoyed analyzing stocks and bonds and looking at financial statements and getting really into the accounting behind all of the the companies that make the stock market. And that was always my dream. I was like, I want to sell stocks and bonds to people. And then I get to Merrill Lynch and we were very old school back then. This was kind of right on the cusp of like the dawn of ETFs. And I mean, even mutual funds back then were being used by the big wirehouses, but they weren't the dominant product that we were using. At least we were still doing mostly individual stocks and bonds, and with a sleeve of either like closed-end funds and mutual funds. And maybe like I remember around that time, there were some wrap products that were starting to get really popular. Those were really the worst things because they were always like some sort of opaque hedge fund strategy that cost like, 2 and 20. And it was like, boy, if you think whole life insurance policies are weird and opaque, like this thing, that we're trying to sell is even 10 times more opaque. But, I start selling stocks and bonds to people, and this was really old school. I mean, we were getting, I remember this was back when like Richard Bernstein was the head of equity analysis for Merrill Lynch. And we would get a research report in the morning, and it would say Coca-Cola has been downgraded from buy to hold, and we're selling it in every client account now. So go through your client list and call them up and tell them, hey, this is what we're doing, and let's see how much commission you can rack up. And that was the other thing, was that we were we were sort of just churning accounts for commission dollars based on the research analysis. And a real serious turning point in my career was I had brought on a family friend that I was managing their portfolio. And I remember the FDA had downgraded Merck that morning, and we got a research report and it said, hey, we're moving it from buy to a sell, and we're selling this company in everyone's accounts. And this client of mine had a huge position in Merck. It was, back then it was like $100,000 or something. And it was like 10% of his portfolio. And I remember calling him and saying, hey, we're going to sell this. And the commission was like $2,000. It was crazy. And I remember this was back when I had just opened a free trade account for my wife and bought a whole bunch of like what were then sort of new ETFs, just really boring, diversified portfolio. But it was all commission free, which back then was really unusual. And free trade ultimately ended up getting bought out by Ameritrade. And, of course, now they're all free. But I remember, I'll never forget. I'd probably placed a trade in her account that week or something. I remember paying $0 in commission. And, back then I'm making like, I don't know, my first year salary at Merrill was probably like 30 grand or something. It was like a sad number. And I remember making that trade, hanging up the phone, $2,000 commission, and I felt like sick to my stomach. And because I knew not only analytically, I was like, this is a great company. It's down like 40% on this FDA announcement. Everything, and this is an extremely expensive trade. Everything about it felt wrong to me. I was like, if anything, we should maybe be buying more of this, or at a minimum, holding it for the long run. Now I'm smart enough to know that picking individual stocks is a bad idea to begin with. But, back then I wasn't quite up to snuff on that sort of stuff. So I still didn't think picking individual stocks was necessarily a bad way to build an investment portfolio. But that was like a turning point where I was like, I can't do this. I know this is not the best way to service clients. And I think within probably 6 months I left. And I spun off on my own. I spun off with like a pitiful amount of money, which in retrospect is almost like laughable that I did this, that I was arrogant enough to think that like I could spin off and make enough money and run a business. But I kind of knew. I was like, I basically called all my clients who I knew would leave with me. And I was like, hey, we can leave. I can start a RIA on my own. We'll do the same basic stuff and I'll cut your fees in half. Because I'll stop charging commissions. I was like, we all win. I'll make more, you'll keep more. It's a win-win all around. And everybody who I talked to was like, yeah, of course, that seems great. Which in retrospect for them also seems kind of crazy because I was leaving this big, like, what then was, I guess, thought of as like a stalwart brand in the industry, almost ultimately went bankrupt a few years later. And, people trusted me enough to go off, with a solo guy who had no brand and, no reason to be trusted, really.
I think it's interesting that he was surprised by the number of people who trusted him and were willing to spin off with him in that move. We already knew by this point in the convo, right? Like we're flies on the wall listening to the story. If I had been a client, even if I didn't think he was the smartest person I knew, which let's face it, he is one of the smartest people I know. But, he's definitely somebody who has showed us through the telling of the story. And if, I'm a client living it with him, I would have known that, like, this is someone who has high integrity and he's working his butt off to make sure he's doing right by me. So, yeah, like I'd have easily spun off with him as a client, hands down.
At that point, I spun off and I continued doing sort of the stock picking thing. I weirdly, and this is again probably a stroke of luck in my career, where for 5 years I ran a limited partnership then. So structured the RIA as a limited partnership, and I was doing basically all overnight trading. And there's a famous anomaly called the overnight anomaly that now has been researched and picked over and studied. And there was even an ETF that, flamed out a few years ago. But the sort of famous research shows that stocks overnight generate much, much higher returns than they do during the trading day. And so the strategy I was running back then was basically buying some stocks. I would buy a handful of stocks at the close and I would sell them at the open. And I was doing this every day, doing huge amounts of research. And this was for 5 years, basically, from the period right before the financial crisis leading up to it. And it worked. I made a lot of money. The returns were really good. Clients were really happy. And then the financial crisis happened. And I remember there was about a 6 to 9 month period where the strategy just completely stopped working. And I remember, it had worked flawlessly for like 5 years. And I remember thinking like this was basically early 2008. And I remember thinking something really strange is happening. Like the financial markets are not functioning. They're functioning completely differently than they had the previous sort of 5 years where everything was kind of calm. That period in the early 2000s was, I don't know if you remember it, but it was really calm. I mean, calm, like kind of like the pre-COVID period was calm, that 2015 to 2020 period. Just, despite all the bad narratives and all the scary stuff that people were constantly saying, nothing could stop this like slow uptick in the market. And so I got really lucky in that if I had spun off my RIA in 2008, I would have been selling life insurance in 2009 again. For sure.
You've been broke in 12 months.
Yeah, for sure. So I was lucky enough that I was able to kind of, scrape by and make enough money on my own that I made the independent world work. And then the financial crisis happens. And I think I probably went like 9 months without making a single dollar. It was scary. I remember I was like dusting off my resume, and it was around late 2008 where I started writing a blog. And that was the blog that ultimately became Pragmatic Capitalism. And I was writing about basically economics again.
The next part is also super interesting. There's some luck there for sure, but there's intention, there's focus, there's work ethic, the willingness to dig in. I think he's really good at thinking about how he's thinking. And I would opine, knowing what I know about brain science, that nobody's really a rational thinker, but he's as rational and kind of quote unquote correct thinking as anybody that we know. And that's paid off for him. And he's stuck to that. And there's a recent Twitter convo that I would urge you to go find about mortgages and who owns your house, and him trying to offset some people that are thinking, in my opinion, very incorrectly, very emotional and not rational at all. And it's paid off for him and his business and his blog and in everything that he's doing. It's just super impressive.
I basically started writing about the monetary system exclusively because there was so much stuff going on then that was just so unusual. Mm-hmm. I was, again, another stroke of luck was 2008. I happened to have a family friend who worked at Nomura who knew a guy named Richard Koo, who was the head economist at the bank or at Nomura in Japan. And Japan had been doing everything that the United States was about to embark on for 20 years. Yeah. And so I am obsessively on the phone and emailing this family friend of mine who's, much older than me, much more experienced, much smarter. And he's telling me the whole time, he's like, I'm going to walk you through all the accounting, all the balance sheet dynamics of this. And then I'm going to show you what these policies do. And we walked through everything, and I was like, holy cow, this guy almost has like a cheat sheet for what is going to happen to the US economy in the next like 5 years.
Wow.
Due to quantitative easing and all this stuff.
Right, because Japan did the very same thing.
Japan did the exact same thing, and they had almost the exact same monetary system structure too, where they have, they basically copied the United States in terms of the way their central bank is set up, the way their banks work with the central bank, the way that their treasury works in coordination with the central bank. And so it was all just, not identical, but really like eerily similar. And so I started really obsessively writing about this. And the big narrative back then was, hyperinflation's coming. The Fed is printing money and all this stuff is going to crash the dollar. And I remember, studying this with my family friend and then applying it to the US and, writing basically, hey, no, this is all wrong. This all does the exact opposite of what you think it does. So it was super counterintuitive. And I think that's part of what was really attractive about my research back then was that, and the blogging that I was doing was I was writing these articles that were saying things that were so controversial that they got a lot of airtime and luckily ended up being largely right. In the sense that like hyperinflation did not come. It caused more disinflation and deflation than anything else, and it caused interest rates to go down. And so there was all this counterintuitive stuff. And so the blog basically turned into like a macroeconomic research resource, I think, to a large degree. And so much of it turned into me just sort of debunking nonsense, I think, because there were so many bad narratives. And a lot of this was in large part because at that point in my career, after when my stock picking luck kind of ran out, I reverted back to this big sort of macro picture. And, a lot of people may not think that indexing strategies and sort of a Boglehead or Vanguard style indexing strategy doesn't, necessarily reflect a macro strategy. But I would argue that it's the ultimate macro strategy, actually. It's the smartest way to probably implement a macroeconomic strategy in terms of just big, broad diversification, acknowledging that picking what is going to do the best when and where is beyond difficult and probably not even worth trying. And that's one of the big lessons from macroeconomics is that, when you learn how complex the whole system is, it humbles you to a large degree. And then you learn that the system is always changing and, there's new asset classes and, things like Bitcoin or whatever it is that come along and you're like, holy cow, I got to relearn how the whole financial system works because what if this other asset class like overtakes the old financial system? And it's like, so everything's always evolving. I think macroeconomics is very humbling in the sense that it teaches you how complex the system is, where even when you get to a point where you think you know a lot, you're always confronted with an environment where you're like, I don't know anything, or I don't know enough to actually be able to navigate this in the, the optimal sense. And so, again, that's one of the basic reasons for diversification is you diversify in large part because you're acknowledging that you don't know everything and that you can't know everything. And you're sort of hedging.
But more importantly, you can't know, right? I mean, if you think about, we love to criticize our weather forecasters, right? Anybody who understands the number of variables in the linear equation that makes up how our weather works would never criticize anybody who attempted to forecast it.
And it's funny, I always tell people like there's certain factions of like the indexing community who will say like, oh, forecasts are totally useless. You should never try to make a prediction. And I'm always like, well, you have to make a forecast to some degree. You have to understand where you are in your life or your financial plan and then try to, establish an asset allocation that corresponds based on certain predictions. Like you kind of have to embed an inflation prediction and the stock market expected return expectation, the bond market expected return forecast. And so, forecasting is necessary to some degree. I think the thing where people get into a lot of trouble is, and this is something I've become really obsessive about in the last few years, is understanding your ability to forecast things over specific time horizons. So like, I die reading Twitter, especially in weeks like this week where the market has been just really crazy. And you've got these two groups who one.
Could you imagine trying to trade the Nikkei this week? You'd have gotten crushed.
But one group is arguing, that everything's going to hell in a handbasket and that you need to be hyper short-term with your stock market portfolio. And then the other group is saying, oh, you're overreacting. You need to be bullish in the short term with your stock market portfolio. And I'm on the sidelines kind of being like, nobody knows what the stock market is going to do this week or next year.
Right.
Maybe not even this decade.
Sure.
So you've got these two competing groups that are constantly arguing about the short-term moves of inherently long-term asset classes. And I'm always like,
right.
What's the point of all this?
I love all the little tangential places that this conversation went with Cullen. Not only did he journal for us his 180 from stock picking to financial planning, and how much of a respect he has for financial planning first, and as a way to think about your finances. But he also talked about how having kids affected his perspective, how much that affected his perspective, and research and thoughts about how to put together a portfolio. Then not just that, but the kind of life that he was building, the kind of financial plan he was developing, and the way that he was thinking about the money he's saving, the money that he's spending, and the impact of his investment decisions on the legacy that he's going to be able to leave for his kids and their kids. And, not just for them, but for his clients and then their clients' kids and their kids. Like, it's really neat to see how he's roped that in and then considered that, even also thinking about his thoughts, like it's affected him. He lives his life like very full in the sense that not only does his thinking affect his research, affect his writing, affect his investment selection, but he incorporates the meaning of life and the impact of that on the people in his life too. And I just love all that.
It's funny. So that's kind of the biggest, I think, sort of transformative development in my life was, especially in recent years, was having kids. I'm 44 now. I had kids late. We went through a lot of like fertility problems and, an awful, like a really awful, like 5-year period of trying to have kids. And then ultimately we got, 2 beautiful girls. But when I had my girls, especially, when I had my first girl, I sort of woke up, and day after I think we brought her home, I kind of sat down, and that was the first time where I kind of like was getting back to work, and COVID was just starting to happen. So it was like the markets were kind of like just starting to melt down, and I'm the guy in the shower crying every night over, everything that's going on and getting no sleep. But the thing that really sort of transformed my thinking at that point was I sort of woke up and realized, I was like, I don't know what my investment time horizon is anymore. And I remember going through, there was that brief COVID crash. On paper, we lost a lot of money during that. And I remember thinking, and then my risk profile was not even like over the top crazy or anything, but I remember going through that and thinking, oh crap, this isn't my money necessarily anymore. This is now the family money. This is my daughter's money. This could determine what her life outcomes are like. And it transformed not just my own risk profile, but the way I think about the financial markets in terms of especially time horizons. Because like I had always thought of my own time horizon as just singular. It was me and my wife's time horizon. We could spend money across this one lifetime, across certain time periods for certain things, and that was it. And when my daughter was born, it created this sort of multi-temporal problem where I was like, wait a minute, now I've got all these expenses for my daughter when she's young, but I also need to start thinking from like an estate planning perspective where, this is now multi-generational money potentially.
You added an exponent.
And that, yeah, it created a problem for me where I now had to sort of think about my asset allocation in terms of like all these different time horizons. And that was kind of the point where I wrote a paper called Defined Duration Investing, where I tried to actually quantify what are the, like using almost like a bond like duration metric, what are the durations of all asset classes or even all strategies? And my real goal was mainly to try to create like an implied equity duration, basically, where I could, kind of going back to our previous conversation about everybody talking about the stock market on a weekly basis. It drove me crazy the way people would think about the stock market in this super short-term sense. But at the same time, it's understandable because nobody knows what the time horizon of the stock market is. Is it a daily instrument? Is it a perpetual instrument? Like it doesn't have a defined duration. And so the goal with this paper was to try to define a duration for what is a reasonable time horizon over which we can expect the stock market to do certain things. So my research basically came to the conclusion that the stock market is roughly like you can call it like a 15 to 20 year instrument. I came up with ultimately it was 17.5 years, I think, when I published the paper. And over that time period, you can expect with a very high degree of certainty that the stock market will do, say, 6 to 7% real returns. And but you have to be super, super patient with that instrument. So if you're thinking about it in terms of
trade at the wrong time ruins the whole thing.
Yeah. But if you think about it in terms of the 17-day instrument or even 17 months, like you're misunderstanding the way this instrument accrues its returns. Because if you think of especially like the lifetime of a corporation, look at the companies in the S&P 500. I mean, these are companies that, they're decades old. And think of how many companies never made it to that point, that never even survived. The lifetime of a corporation is extremely long, and it takes a long time to accrue profits and accrue revenues even. And so when you think about these instruments, these entities in terms of very short time horizons, I think you're sort of fundamentally misunderstanding the instrument. And I applied this in a way where I can then almost, like my real goal, it's funny, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have said financial planning was useless, but I probably would have said it was overrated. And boy, I have done like a huge 180 on that since then. I would say that if you don't start from a financial
validating my existence.
Yeah. But if you don't start from a financial planning foundation now, I think you're going to run into problems at some point, behaviorally or financially with your portfolio, because I think, and this is kind of going back to, I think a lot of the problems I had at the beginning of my career, where a lot of the investment management business, and especially portfolio managers, build products that in a lot of ways have sort of inherent conflicts relative to people's financial plans. Like you'll never, if somebody walks into your offices, do you ever say, our goal is to beat the market?
No.
Like that's not a financial planning based goal. It has no relevance to your financial plan. But when you look at investment management products, I mean, almost every single one, or the vast majority of them, they are specifically designed to beat the market, beat an index, beat something. Like that is the goal. And so there's these inherent conflicts in the way that almost all of these products are built.
Agreed. And it's interesting seeing his shift from not thinking about legacy to thinking about it a lot. And he's still a young man. It's not like he's old. And he's humble too. And I don't know what his balance sheet and cash flow statement look like, but I'm going to guess that he's got pretty much the four components of wealth nailed down pretty well: the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and the financial. But he's humble. You would not know that. He's just Cullen.
It's a lot of mistakes is what it is. In retrospect, my life, it's true though. It's, I think my ability to learn, like I'm not the smartest guy in the world. And I've always kind of known that, but I'm having developed this sort of like aggressive, open-minded mentality, I've become very good at making mistakes and then learning from them. Like I love my second oldest daughter is constantly saying, my bad, I'm sorry I did that. And I don't know if she got this from me or something, but like she's so accountable when she'll spill a drink or something and she'll be like, oh, my bad. That's my fault, Dad. My fault, Daddy. I'll clean it. And I'm like, I almost feel bad in that, like she feels bad for what she did. But at the same time, I'm like, you're accountable for this in a way that I am like so jealous of. I love it. And I think that's the way I've been a lot of my life, is that I've held myself accountable and learned from making a lot of mistakes over time, and then trying to be a little bit better despite all those mistakes.
And I appreciated his candor too. We tend to hush folks when they say people only get into finance to get rich.
Well, some people do. So
right.
That's just a reality.
Yeah. I mean, the narrative's there because it happens.
Right.
Right.
Stereotypes exist for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Cullen, to your point, like he wasn't too swayed by his ego to not recall that piece of his journey as well. But then, he talked about that's where I started. Those were kind of the voices, the influences in my life. And this is how it's evolved. And I think we see it evolve as he continued along the way to go, no, that's not me. And then he recentered back on who he was and what mattered most to him. And again, hat tip back to his family, back to his wife, like just the influences that they've had on him and who he is along the way kept giving him that push to be like, to figure out, why do I want to consider pursuing this career? What is it that I am? Who is it that I am? And how can I bring that to this career?
I think it's interesting. I got into finance because I wanted to get rich. And then when I was at my second oldest brother's graduation, and I'm talking to my uncle. I was probably a sophomore maybe, and I'm trying to pick my major. And I think I was like focused on marketing or something, like something creative. And my uncle, I'll never forget it. He was like, you have to go into finance. It's where the money is. And if you don't have money, what do you have? And I remember, I was too naive at the time to probably understand, the nuance of a comment like that and how either misguided or brilliant it was. But I got into finance basically thinking like, oh, I want to just make gobs of money. And then the older and older I've gotten, the more and more I've realized that being the person who just wants to make money will A, make me unhappy, but B, it'll probably make my clients ultimately unhappy because I'm basically selling like a false promise to them. And, it's the whole beat the market thing. I'll generate high returns in exchange for high fees. And it's really what it ends up basically being is it's the hope of high returns in exchange for the guarantee of high fees. And that trade doesn't usually work out so great for the client, and I don't know if it was the moral backbone or what it was, but I ultimately, the older I've gotten, the more I think, really learned to sort of appreciate having just a lot of balance in my life and not overvaluing just making money.
And so to kind of sum that up, we'll play out the last snippet from our convo. It's a pretty large perspective shift on what constitutes wealth when you truly embrace it. And I'm talking about the 4 components that I think about as wealth. It's not just the money part. And we are so glad that he brought it up.
But I've always, and this is one of the biggest struggles with, I think, finances and people's money, is constantly, comparing yourself to some alternate reality and not looking at your world for what it is and appreciating just how good most of us have it. I mean, even like I constantly write about how the median American is in the top 1% of wealth in the whole world. I mean, that is an astounding statistic. So the median person who probably feels like, you know, they're looking at their neighbor or the top 1% in the United States, they feel like they don't have a lot. But if you had this broader worldview, you would look at the whole world and you fall back and you say, I have so much. I was so like, you know, I talk about luck a lot in this episode. It's, you know, being born in America is like, it's the ultimate stroke of luck. You know, and I'm not like trying to downplay that there's, you know, lots of problems in the world, lots of problems in the U.S.
Believe me, if you look at our world in data, you can't help but come to that conclusion.
Yeah, it's just
right. Being born to a parent who has a college degree is a massive stroke of luck.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. You know, kids did that to me to some sense, where you like I would never ever do this before kids, where I would look at my friends and I would see a friend who either was better financially or just seemed to be like a better parent in some way, or was doing more things, more fun things with their kids. And I would compare myself and say, you know, God, I'm not as good. I need to level up. And I catch myself a lot of the times, you know, being like, wait, you know, you need to stop comparing yourself to all these other people, because there's always going to be that person that even when you level up, there's always going to be somebody else who's another level up. And you're just, you know, it becomes this like rat race of like, you know, where am I going with all this? And it's nice to fall back sometimes. I'm constantly trying to remind myself of, you know, be appreciative of all the things you have, all the things you've been given, the relationships you've developed, and, you know, try not to take those things for granted in the search for something even greater.
All right, Mark. Are we really going to talk about macroeconomics?
Well, why not? I don't know anything about it, so that makes me perfectly qualified to talk about it, because I'll be just as accurate as the macroecons are.
Yes. We'll give you that for today. But no, I do have some starter questions. And I think the way that I want to come at this is not a macroeconomics lesson, because I'm pretty sure I slept through most of those in college. But I want to know why it matters. And I think that's probably why I struggled with it as a class and or even as a career path. Why does it matter? Specifically with regards to someone that's not in the finance industry, who's just trying to save, invest, spend, give, according to their personal goals. Should they care about macroeconomics? Does it matter to them? Sorry, that's way more than one question. Feel free to start wherever you want to start. But that's kind of my burning, like, it's not even anger, but it is angst about macroeconomics. Is to the normal person, does it matter?
Well, first of all, we'd have to define normal, and I'm not sure you can.
Okay, fair.
But a lot of it depends. I mean, if you're going to be your own investor, I think macroeconomics matters. I mean, Cullen's proven that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, let's just take a current example. Let's look at housing in the United States. We clearly have a limited amount of supply and excess demand. Mm-hmm. This is old J-curve macroecon stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And so, pricing is painful for a lot of people right now. And that is just the market.
Yeah.
And if you look at macroeconomics, I mean, is an additional $25,000 from our government going to be enough to stimulate, to allow people to meet the pricing need? Something tells me that in a world of limited supply, increasing the demand by giving people more money is just going to make higher prices. Now, if we can find a way to economically and quickly build 3 million additional homes, that, right, increases the supply, and it'll maybe even keep prices level or perhaps drop them. I don't know the total amount of housing in the United States and the total shortage and all that. But yeah, these kinds of things can matter if you're thinking about investing in the housing market one way or another. For most people who don't have or don't want to spend the time to think about that and make some individual bets. And again, let me be clear, this is not financial advice. You're probably better off in a more diversified approach. But if you wanted to maybe take a bet with a couple of percent of your portfolio, maybe that's a place where you want to aim some dollars. Maybe it isn't. Maybe given what's going on in the world today, you might want to put some money in weapons manufacturers, right? These are all macro bets, essentially. And there are investors who've done very, very well being macro. You could argue that Peter Lynch was a macro investor in an interesting kind of way, right? He would have walked into Target 20 years ago and bought the stock because he'd see the supply demand going on there and see their market positioning. Now, you could call that stock picking, but you think about the way he thought about it, and the way he thought about it is this a business that a lot of people would do business with? That's a macro conversation in my bet. So I don't know if I can answer all three questions, but I think there's a reason why you could care about macroeconomics. I would say for the average person, it's probably not where I would spend a lot of time. But I mean, for me, for example, I find it very interesting, regardless of whether you did well in the classes in school or not. But I would always return to what are your personal goals? On an average rate of return perspective, how much do you need to save to meet them? And systematically do that. And that, in a big way, is a macro set of actions. Save enough, save consistently, do it in a diversified way. In a lot of ways, that's macro. That's not micro. That's not exactly where do I put my savings. I need to pick where every single dollar goes. That's not the micro and stock picking. That's a more macro bet. You're making a macro bet on the U.S. and worldwide economy in a diversified portfolio. That's what you're making.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things I want to tease out from that. So there's a couple of things that, or a couple of different types of people that you identified, right? You identified someone who is interested in a particular idea or lane of the market, like, for example, real estate, as a way to invest. And if that is something that you are leaning toward, if that is something that you are interested in, then that puts you in a space where you might want to take note of the macroeconomics of that lane, of that idea. That's one type of person. The other type of person is just, I want to make sure I'm okay. I want to make sure that I can retire one day. I want to make sure that I can leave a certain amount of money to my kids. Maybe the better path for that person is diversification. Maybe the better path for that person is to take a strategic, patient, diversified approach to building that type of wealth. If they aren't interested in a particular idea, I think what I see happen a lot is somebody on this side of the road where they're just like, I just want to be okay. I just want to make sure I can leave X amount to my kids. I just want to make sure I can pay my bills. And they go, oh, shiny object in the macroeconomics field, housing market, that could solve all of my problems. Or Bitcoin, that could solve all of my problems. And you pull that one idea over into this long-term retirement plan and you try to fill the gap with this shiny object and idea. And I think that gets particularly dangerous. And then the other thing that I see if you are someone who does or is interested in leaning into a particular idea, the danger that I see for people there is they think about all the reasons why it could go right. And they forget to think about all the reasons why it could go wrong, and why they could end up on the wrong side of that trade, how they could end up on the wrong side of that trade. And I think that's a big part of macroeconomics that is difficult to tease out because there are a lot of voices and there's a lot of noise feeding the negativity. And so it's hard to find the correct pieces of information about both the positive, what could go right, and also the negative, what could go wrong. And I think, maybe that's something that Cullen's done a pretty decent, if not more than decent job of doing, is putting out good information on both sides of that trade. Reasons why it could go right, reasons why it could go wrong. And and thinking very high level about that kind of information. So thoughts on that? Any tips or suggestions for someone who's curious how to dip their toes into the water of a particular subset of the economic landscape, like real estate? Not specifically places to go to look for real estate advice, but like, how do you tease out the good information from the bad? How do you get to a point where you can ignore the noise?
Well, it raises a whole set of questions for me that if I were going to talk to Cullen about his investment philosophy and process, which we did not because we were talking about his trajectory
Right.
and path.
Yeah.
But I'd be interested in understanding how he does his pre-mortems, because I can almost guarantee you that he does pre-mortems on every investment decision.
Yeah.
He probably also sets exit criteria as well as entry criteria, which, by the way, if you go way back, Peter Lynch did very, very well. And I would argue that Mr. Buffett and Mr. Munger probably did very, very well. But I would, and this is going to sound funny, but it really isn't. I would stay off of. I can't call it its current name. I'll call it Twixer. I would stay off of Instagram. I would stay off of, and I can't call it by its real name either, TikTok.
Facebook.
I just can't. Or Facebook.
Yeah.
If you're going to learn about this, you need to read. And you need to read physical books, not electronic books. By the way, there's some neuroscience around retention. Your retention when you read a physical book is like twice what your retention is when you read an electronic book. So if you really want to learn about it, you need to read and study. And I'm not saying you need to go take a class. I think you need to read. We're all, I think, smart enough.
Yeah.
That's how I would dip my toes in. And there are, some pretty major names that you can go find that will help you get educated. And then you can decide whether that's a philosophy for you that you want to adopt and use. I mean, it's from an investment perspective, it's one strategy of many.
Yeah.
And there's no right or wrong in this. I forget who it is. It's Peter Lazaroff, right?
Yeah.
Throws questions out there.
Yeah.
And one of the questions, and he's good at it, and I know he's with a competing firm and all that, but I don't care. There's plenty for everybody. That's a macro thing right there, right? There's enough for all of us.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't work for the same firm. It doesn't matter to me. There's plenty for everybody. But in any case, he asked a question about an investment philosophy you hold that's not popular. And my answer to that is any investment strategy can work pretty much if it's got a reasonable level of diversification. Any investment strategy can work if you know what your exit criteria are and you stick to them, and you maintain a sufficient cash reserve to deal with the volatility that particular strategy might have. So let's just say that you want a max rate of return. So you're going to go all small cap, all international emerging markets. Pretty volatile strategy, right? You could be down 70, 80% at any given point.
Yeah.
It's happened.
Yeah.
But if you look, it's still up and to the right. But
big picture,
if you're 64 and you're 100% equity and you decide you're going to stop the cash flow that comes from whatever work you do, whether it's self-employed or a job, and that's your strategy, you might need 5 to 7 years of cash reserve to get you through market recovery.
That's right.
So that's something I hold that is very much a macro strategy. I'm not stock picking in small cap, but it would work, at least given the 100 years of data that we have. Now, could it not work tomorrow? Sure. Also brings up another macro phrase. The most dangerous 4 words in investing this time is different. That's very much a macro phrase.
Yep.
But I would definitely stay off the social media stuff.
Yeah.
Except for Cullen. And I don't know, maybe Corey Hoffstein, and there are a couple other people.
Yeah.
But that's not the place to learn about.
But you can access them through their blogs as well.
100%.
Great thinkers are, in my experience, usually great writers. Once they decide to turn that into a part of their craft, and so most of those folks have blogs and other written work available to learn. And it doesn't take a lot of studying. Maybe it's 15 minutes at night before you turn off the lights or first thing in the morning. I think you have a pretty structured approach to reading where you read.
I do. I read 10 pages a day.
10 pages a day.
What I'm currently reading is funny enough about clear thinking. And I strongly encourage you, if you want to learn how to think better, follow Shane Parrish. The man is a genius. But yeah, I do have a structured approach.
Yeah. So I think that's a perfect way of.
That's for an ADHD person learned, by the way. That's not natural.
Yeah. But whatever works for you. But I do think that kind of consistent daily habit is a great way to start figuring this out, if that's something that you want to your point, dip your toes in the water of. Final question. I think this is something that I want to hopefully put out into, speak into words, so that if somebody is holding back from working with a financial professional for this reason, this can maybe clear up some caution or concerns or some worry that they may have about connecting with a financial planner or financial advisor. How much of macroeconomics do you typically talk about in a regular client meeting?
Well, that's a great question that I never really thought about. But since I'm incapable of being silent, I have actually formulated an answer. Whether it's right or wrong is a whole nother conversation, but we can talk about that later. As my wife says, often wrong, never in doubt. She's actually describing herself, which is true. But one could argue that maybe being female in our environment requires that, but I don't want to go down that road either. Yeah. Maybe that's a topic for you to take up. But in any case, I will tell you that it happens fairly often, but not intentionally and not because we're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where we are right now. I think it's fair to say that there's some angst in our country around our election, right? I think that's fair to say, regardless of what candidate you support or what you believe. Well, funny enough, on January 24th, I put a piece in my Substack about elections in the United States and what they mean for investment results. Mm-hmm. That is very much a macro conversation. And if you want to read it, I encourage you to go read my Substack. It's not an ad for my Substack. I'll tell you what it says. In summary, it says that no party or president is favored in terms of rate of return on your investments, period. And whether they control the entire government or portions of it, it doesn't matter. Statistically, there's a slight edge to the Democrats. That's just the data.
It's just the data.
And I would never tell you to choose a candidate by that.
Yeah.
But that's just the data. And that's what it says. It's not uncommon for us to have a conversation about the status of the U.S. dollar, which Cullen also has some commentary on relatively recently.
Yeah.
So I think it happens fairly often, but it's not a client saying, hey, I've got this macroecon question.
Yeah.
It's mostly around, this is something that worries me. What do you think?
Yeah.
Because again, the key question in what we do and what all financial advisors do is having the client understand that they either are or are not going to be okay on their current trajectory.
Right.
And taking action to either support the yes, I am okay, or start to mitigate, no, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
So I think we probably typically talk about it in nearly every client meeting, mm-hmm. but not cognitively, not at top of mind. Hey, if I wanted to have a client deselection machine, I would send out the pre-meeting agenda and say, hey, we're going to talk about macroecon today.
Yes, that's my point. Yeah. Yeah. I think you would get zero, maybe a few hands raised.
I would have zero members in my client Hall of Fame too.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the point that I'm getting at. Is I think there's just maybe some worry and some concern that if I meet with a financial advisor, they're going to talk over my head about finance topics that I don't understand and quite frankly aren't interested in learning. I just want to know, like you said, I just want to know that I'm going to be okay. Or if I'm not, how do I right the ship? How do I get this car back on the road? And the concern is, do I have to know about the housing market in order to do that? Do I have to understand and invest in gold in order to do that? Like they're filling in the gaps with my macroeconomics concerns and thinking that they might need to feel or be a little more educated on that before they approach a financial advisor. And I just want to take that air out of the room and say, you don't. You are able to come with your concerns and your worries without knowing the answer to that question, without feeling like you need to be more educated on economics. And you can sit in that room and you can create a plan and you can walk away with a strategy and a set of to-do items that are going to get you closer to where you need to be without actually having to understand macroeconomics and without actually having to worry that your financial advisor is going to make you feel uncomfortable. And if they do, that's not like run, right? That's not what's required in order for you to be okay.
And whether it's your doctor or your financial advisor or your attorney, or your CPA, if they're talking over your head, that actually to me is a sign that you've got the wrong person. Yeah. Because the advisor's job, regardless of what advisory profession they're in, and I was a technology consultant before I got into this business, is to understand the client and what the client needs, and to put things in terms that the client understands. That's our job. Yeah. And so, and what you see from Cullen is he's actually good at doing that with a topic that most people think is really complicated. And I would argue that if you look at the linear equation that makes up, economics in the U.S., it is really complicated, which is why all the forecasters get it wrong. Yeah. Because if you've got a linear equation with a couple of hundred variables, one of them being off blows the whole thing up. Yeah. So you can be wrong in a that looks like in a very big way from being wrong only in one little teeny tiny area that just affected how that whole thing will multiply out. So, from that perspective, I thank Cullen for inspiring this conversation, being a guest, being a clear writer, willing to share what he believes and knows, and hopefully everybody walked away with something. Mm-hmm. And if you want to go birth goats, you can talk to Cullen and learn how. And if you want to go become a CFA and get a very technical, professional background, and then go become an advisor and a fund manager, you can learn how to do that too. Mm-hmm. Pretty broad spectrum. Yeah. 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 No limits to the path that you can take into financial services. No limits to the path that you can take toward accomplishing the financial goals that you have, even if you're not a financial professional. Like, there's just, I hope you walk away from this conversation knowing that there are no limits to what you can do. Just keep putting in the work, keep showing up, and with integrity and with intention. So thank you, Cullen, for inspiring that and inspiring this conversation around it. And thank you to everyone listening in.
Big thanks to our amazing guests who agreed to join us on a journey through their career stories on How Did We Get Here?
If you've enjoyed the laughs, surprises, and unexpected turns, be sure to hit subscribe for more intriguing tales.
Your support means the world to us.
Until the next episode, keep asking, keep exploring, and keep wondering.
How did we get here? This podcast is not intended as and may not be considered to be investment advice and does not constitute a recommendation of any investment strategy or product for a particular investor. The information presented on this program is believed to be factual and up to date, but we do not guarantee its accuracy, and it should not be regarded as a complete analysis of the subjects discussed. Discussions should not be construed as an offer to buy or sell or a solicitation of an offer to buy or sell the investments mentioned. Investors should consult a financial professional before making any investment decisions. The opinions are those of the host and interviewees at the time of the podcast recording and are subject to change. These comments should not be construed as recommendations, but as an illustration of broader themes. Forward-looking statements are not guarantees of future results. They involve risks, uncertainties, and assumptions. There can be no assurance that actual results will not differ materially from expectations. Investments involve varying degrees of risks, and there can be no assurance that any specific investment or strategy will be suitable or profitable for our client's portfolio. All investment strategies can result in profit or loss. Just Boss is an investment advisor representative of Wealth Tech Partners, LLC, DBA, Lake Avenue Financial, which is a registered investment advisor and only conducts business in jurisdictions where it is properly registered or is excluded or exempted from registration requirements. Mark Newfield is an investment advisor representative of Journey Strategic Wealth, which is a registered investment advisor and only conducts business in jurisdictions where it is properly registered or is excluded or exempted from registration requirements. Registration as an investment advisor is not an endorsement of the firm by securities regulators and does not mean the advisor has achieved a specific level of skill or ability. The firm is not engaged in the practice of law or accounting. You should always consult an attorney or tax professional regarding your specific legal or tax situation.